Alright class, so today we are going to talk about the lymphatic system and I'll be honest with you, not one of my favorite chapters because it's simple and I don't know, I don't get enough kick to talk about the lymphatic system. If I were in the designing team of the human body, if God picked me ever in the designing team, I could have totally bypassed the lymphatic system. Anyway, so today we are going to talk about the lymphatic system. It's not a long lecture. I would pretty much focus on the information that you must know for your upcoming lecture quiz. Okay. So we will start by talking about the functions of the lymphatic system first. And the most important function of the lymphatic system is to return excess interstitial fluid back into venous circulation. So let's talk about this. If you look at the picture here, you do see the arterial end of a capillary. And obviously we see red blood cells flowing through the capillary. And due to high blood pressure, fluid is forced out of the capillary into the interstitial space, as shown by these arrows here. So when the blood pressure in the capillary is too high, fluid is forced out of this capillary into the interstitial space. Now, most of this fluid is actually reabsorbed back into the venous, back into the system at the venous end of the capillaries. But usually about an excess of 3 liters of fluid remains in the interstitial space. This excess fluid that remains in the interstitial space is picked up by the lymphatic vessels, as shown by the arrows here. I'll just change color. Okay. Now the blue arrows that I'm drawing represents the pickup of the excess interstitial fluid back into the lymphatic capillaries. So the lymphatic capillaries pick up this excess fluid from the interstitial space and drains it back into the venous circuit. Okay. Now what happens if the excess fluid accumulates in the interstitial space? That's too bad. It can lead to edema, which is swelling of the tissue, and this can also cause decrease in blood volume. Obviously, if you have a lot of fluid in the interstitial space, so what's happening to the blood volume? Obviously, in that case, you will have a drop in blood volume. Therefore, the lymphatic system helps maintain normal blood volume in the cardiovascular system. That's one of the most important functions of the lymphatic system. The second function is transportation of lipids from the GI tract into the bloodstream. Let's talk about this. Now, the lipids that we take, dietary lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins, they cannot be absorbed from the GI tract directly into the blood. Therefore, these larger molecules are transported by tiny lymph vessels called lacteals, as shown here. So the green vessel that you see, this right here, this is called a lacteal, and the lacteal absorbs the larger molecules, lipid molecules, and transport it and ultimately drain it into larger lymph vessels, and eventually it goes into the bloodstream. So, to review, lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins cannot enter directly into the bloodstream from the GI tract. Therefore, the lymphatic capillary, specialized lymphatic capillary called lacteal, as shown by the green structure here, lacteal picks up the lipid and lipid-soluble vitamins from the intestine and then ultimately drains it into larger lymphatic vessels, which then transports it to bloodstream. The third important function is production and maturation of lymphocytes. So lymphatic organs, there are lymphatic organs in the body, and these lymphatic organs house lymphocytes, which are a special type of white blood cell. Now, some lymphatic organs help in maturation of the lymphocytes, whereas other organs help in mitotic division of the lymphocyte. More to be discussed later in this lecture. And finally, the lymphatic system always scans the blood and interstitial fluid for antigens and generates appropriate immune response wherever and whenever necessary. So lymphatic cells, there are different types of lymphatic cells like B lymphocyte, T lymphocyte, and macrophages. They help in the process of generating an immune response. Again, more to be discussed later in this lecture. So today we are going to talk about lymph. What is lymph actually? We will also look at different types of lymphatic vessels. We will talk about lymphatic capillaries, which are tiny lymphatic vessels. Then there are lymphatic vessels. We'll talk about lymphatic trunks, lymphatic ducts. So all these four, capillaries, vessels, trunks, and ducts, these are vessels. These are some sort of lymphatic vessels. The easiest way to remember, CV is on your to-do list. Remember, CV is on your to-do list. C stands for capillaries, V stands for vessels, T for trunk, and D for duct. Okay, so capillaries, vessels, trunks, and ducts, these are different types of lymphatic vessels. They do vary in size. And then we will also talk about lymphatic cells. And then finally, we will cap off our lecture by talking about lymphatic nodules and lymphatic organs. Alright, so what is lymph? Know that lymph is a combination of interstitial fluid, some solutes, and sometimes antigen. That's what lymph is made up of. If I ask you, do you see red blood cell in lymph? The answer is no. Okay, so know that lymph is made up of interstitial fluid mixed with some solutes and some antigens. That's all lymph is about. Okay, so what do we see here? We do see a blood capillary bed here, right? We do see an arteriole and a venule, and in between the arteriole and the venule there is a blood capillary bed. Now, associated with the blood capillary bed, do you see the green structures? The green structures are actually lymphatic vessels. And the idea is, if I do this again one more time, at the capillary bed, when the pressure is high within the capillary, a little bit of fluid escapes out of the capillary into the interstitial space. And this fluid accumulates in the interstitial space. The excess fluid that cannot really stay in the interstitial space is picked up by the lymphatic capillaries and then ultimately drained into lymphatic vessels as shown by these arrows. Do you see? The lymphatic capillaries picks up the liquid or the excess fluid and then drains it towards larger vessels called lymphatic vessels. Remember, CV is on your to-do list. So the lymphatic capillaries picks up the excess fluid and then transports it towards the lymphatic vessels. And this excess fluid then returns back to the circulation. Okay, so let's talk about lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic vessels. Okay, we will start with lymphatic capillaries first. So we know that if you think of a regular blood capillary, so let's say this is a blood capillary. And if you think of a blood capillary, it's made up of endothelial cells, right? Remember the types of capillaries we talked about in our last lecture? Fenestrated capillary, sinusoids, and all those. Okay. So this is a regular blood capillary lined with endothelial cells. Now, there is a basic difference between regular blood capillary and lymphatic capillary. First, lymphatic capillaries have a wider diameter. So the diameter is wider. So this is a lymphatic capillary. It has a wider diameter. And then it is made up of overlapping endothelial cells, like fish scales. Have you seen fish scales? Yeah, So these cells actually overlap each other like scales in fish. Okay. And there is a reason for having these overlapping endothelial cells. These overlapping cells actually work as one-way valves. How is that, Rupa? Now let's say, let me change color real quick here. Actually, let me pick green. Okay. Now let's say we have lymph in the interstitial space, okay? Now as there is a lot of lymph here in the interstitial space, this lymph will enter the lymphatic capillary this way through in between the gaps of the endothelial cells, right? So now we have lymph getting in. Now as soon as the pressure in the lymphatic capillary gets high, these overlapping endothelial cells work as one-way valves and shuts the overlapping endothelial cells, so the lymph cannot leak back into the interstitial space. Does that make sense? So let's do it one more time. Lymphatic vessel, overlapping endothelial cells, right? We will first have lymph getting into the vessel. This is a lymphatic vessel, lymph getting in. So now after a lot of lymph gets into the vessel, the fluid pressure inside the vessel goes up. And due to that high pressure of fluid inside the vessel, the overlapping endothelial cells are shut closed, so blood cannot leak out. So there is not blood, the fluid. So the fluid cannot leak out, because the overlapping endothelial cells are now shut closed. All right. Now there are specialized lymphatic capillaries associated with the GI tract. We did look at that little in our last slide. And those those specialized lymphatic capillaries of the GI tract are called lacteal, and they transport lipid-rich fluid called chyle. Chyle is the name of the lipid-rich fluid that is transported via lacteals into the larger lymphatic vessels. Now, in the picture on the right hand side, you do see a lymphatic capillary, and you also see the overlapping endothelial cells as shown in green. The green arrows represent flow of interstitial fluid into the lymphatic capillary, and when we have lots of lymph in the lymphatic capillary, as shown by my yellow lines, when the pressure inside the capillary gets high, these endothelial cells shuts, so that the fluid cannot leak out. And remember, the lymphatic capillaries drain into larger vessels called lymphatic vessels. So let's talk about lymphatic vessels now. Lymphatic vessels carry lymph and drain it into the venous supply. There are 4 main types of lymphatic vessels that we will talk about. We are just focusing on lymphatic vessels now. So the lymphatic capillaries pick up lymph and then drain it into lymphatic vessels. And the lymphatic vessels, they work pretty much like the veins of our body. Remember veins, they have 3 tunics: tunica, intima, media, and externa. Lymphatic vessels are the same way. They have 3 tunics. Like the veins, lymphatic vessels also have valves, as shown right here in the picture, and I'm highlighting it with yellow. So the lymphatic vessels have valves, and also remember the veins. The veins work by skeletal muscle pump. The skeletal muscle pump pushes blood against the gravity towards back to the heart. Same with the lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels work by the action of skeletal muscle pump. In this regard, I would like to talk about 2 types of lymphatic vessels. We have afferent and efferent lymphatic vessels. Remember the afferent lymphatic vessels